Good morning. It is January 1st, 2019. Happy New Year to everybody. I did not post yesterday. I didn't do anything yesterday I planned on doing because the night before I could not fall asleep. It was at least 4:30 or 5 before I did fall asleep. And when I ended up waking up, I was too tired to do anything. I did not feel safe going out and giving other people rides, particularly in the rain. Got a good night's sleep last night. Up early. I will be out and driving before 9:30. It's almost 9 o'clock now, so hopefully it'll be a good day. I've got a man date with my good friend Jesse tonight. We're going to go and try some beers at some new place. So it's looking like it hopefully should be a good day. We'll see. I wanted to get back to just providing some stupid information, and one of the easiest ways to do that is with the on this date in history. And I thought January 1st ought to be some interesting things. First off, the birthdays. Happy birthday to Paul Revere, born 1735. Paul Revere is considered an American patriot. There's a lot of mythologies about him. A poem was written where he was warning his buds here in the colonies that the British are coming. And in fact, that's his famous line, the British are coming, the British are coming. And in the poem, he supposedly was going to, I think, be on a tower and have a light, I think one light if by land, two if by sea, if they were showing up that way. Anyway, a lot of that is exaggerated in myth, but he is deeply embedded into our historical memory. Another American deeply embedded in our mythology and roots is Betsy Ross. She's often been credited with designing, sewing, making what turned out to be our flag model. Now, it's been modified a bit since then. I've read recently a few things that maybe she wasn't quite the inventor or the designer, this, that, or whatever. But again, from our national mythology, she's the one. Also, another major American born on this date in 1895, J. Edgar Hoover. He was the founding director of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigations. A lot of mythology about this man, a lot of stories that may or may not be true. A lot of people giggle that he may have been a cross-dresser, may have been homosexual. I don't know. Really, who cares? He did his job. He probably did it too well. Definitely collected and held information on private citizens and public figures that, with questionable motives, to say for sure. And finally, a non-political American, although for a certain generation or two or maybe even three, a very influential person on our adolescence. J.D. Salinger, born on this date in 1919. I've recently heard some podcasts that involved J.D. Salinger, a little bit of his story, personal life, that kind of stuff. Very interesting youth. He was hanging around with some heavyweights in the literature and play and other realms. He was certainly hanging out with some moneyed people, some famous people, some troubled people. And it was a really interesting story. All right. Now, when I looked up today's dates, I found a few interesting things too. There seems to be a thread of U.S. history and slavery that keeps coming up on this day. For example, in 1808, on January 1st, there was a U.S. law enacted, probably. I doubt they voted it on New Year's Day. But a U.S. law banning the importation of slaves. There was a footnote on this that it was widely ignored, which I seem to remember I'm going to say the 1820s or 30s is when we finally stopped the importation of slaves. I wonder if that had anything to do with the British Empire banning slavery throughout all of its territories, I think in the 1830s. They are certainly ahead of the U.S. on that. And if Great Britain was banning the importation of slavery, that may have affected the slave routes and the people running it, which may have made it easier to ban. But that's just guesswork. I'll be honest with you on that. I'm going way off script. Okay, so that was 1808. 1830, William Lloyd Garrison published first edition of The Liberator. Now, The Liberator, I don't know if it was a book or a magazine. It says published first edition. It sounds more like a book, but it could go either way. That the Liberator called for the emancipation of all slaves. Now, this was 1830. Obviously, that didn't happen, but we start to see, just through the focus of this one date, the United States definitely having a difference of opinion on this. And the emancipation movement really did bubble under the surface for quite a long time. Again, I've recently heard some podcasts on American history that talked about that big event in the United States. About 3 or 4 different podcasts that I've listened to, and it's definitely pointing a picture of a country growingly divided over a big issue, and that didn't end terribly well for us. Certainly the issue, or the overarching issue, was never resolved in this country, and we may have ended up missing an opportunity there in the Reconstruction and whatnot. But that does bring us right around to this date in 1863, and this is the biggie. President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was basically a presidential order, an executive order, as we call them in the real world, by the president, saying that all slaves were free in the Confederacy. Now, we make that out to be such a big deal here in the States, particularly when I was being educated as a young man. But the Emancipation Proclamation, to my knowledge, didn't do exactly what we think it did. It did only ban or free the slaves that were in the Confederacy. And as far as the Confederacy was concerned, not a whole lot of authority from Washington, D.C. at that time. So for it to truly be made effective, we did have to end the war and also pass the constitutional amendment, I think the 13th. 3 of them were passed right there in close succession. I think the 13th was the one that freed the slaves, but that, at the very least, Mr. Lincoln was taking a stand on that day, and really for the first time, I think, saying, this is what we're going to do. We are going to end slavery. And that was always kind of on the table, but Lincoln, I don't think, actually took a big stand. His point was to keep the Union together. But again, lots going on there. I'm going to have to look into it a bit more. Moving away from that, we've got another interesting parallel to today. Our race relations in the States are not the best, but also our immigration at the moment is very controversial. And it was on this date, January 1st in 1891, that Ellis Island opened up for the processing of immigrants. At that point, we were getting a lot of immigrants from Europe. So New York made an obvious place for them to come into. And so they set up Ellis Island. Now, if you've seen Godfather 2, that's, I think, sort of the classic movie depiction of what it was like to go through and be processed there at Ellis Island. All right. And I think we're going to end on 1937 with just a nice little piece of fluff history. On this date in 1937, the Hormel Company, at their mansion in Minnesota, was throwing a party introducing a new product. It was a meat in a can product, canned meat. 1937, just before World War II, this product would go on to feed a whole lot of our army. Kind of weirdly, it's really, really popular still to this day in Hawaii and some of the Polynesian islands around there. Anyway, there's a guest at this party, and based on the information I'm having here, it sounds like they were having a fun little contest. They were trying to name this product. And of course, the winning entry was SPAM, SPAM, which somehow stands for pork shoulder and ham. They obviously reversed that there. Only I don't have the name of the person that actually named it. He seems to be anonymous in my source, and he won $100 for naming it. Seems like a good bargain for Hormel. Spam really took off, and it's definitely a memorable name. All right. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you did, this is a much longer video than usual. So good for me to know how quickly I can get carried away again. Happy New Year, and I'll be back to talk to me again sooner. Bye-bye.